I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we consider the precarious situation in the Ukrainian city of Kherson, hear the latest on the political tribulations in Europe and beyond, and reflect on calls for Ukraine to have its own national cemetery.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 1st of October, 2 years and 225 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and, en route to Brussels, our Europe editor, James Crisp. But first I asked Dom for the latest news from and related to the battlefield.
Well, hi Francis. Hello folks. Let's start inside Ukraine, down south in Kherson. At least 7 people killed this morning there, at least 3 others injured in Kherson city when a local market was shelled. This comes from the Prosecutor General's office. The attack happened around 9 a.m. Local time when a nationwide minute of silence was being held in Ukraine to commemorate Defenders' Day today for fallen Ukrainian soldiers. That was given to us by the National Police. Now, I just want to pause for a moment on Kherson. I've been looking at something in the last few weeks. I didn't have enough of it to bring it to you, but I've been putting a few bits and pieces together. I've been speaking to an OSINT analyst, open source intelligence analyst, about what's been going on in Kherson. This very bizarre, terrifyingly bizarre, horrifically bizarre reporting, which is why I wanted to get a bit more certainty about the situation regarding alleged Russian drone attacks on civilians as well as the military in Kherson. It's said to be a dire situation. Now, based on data from official ministries in Kherson and the National Police, they say 266 civilians have been killed or injured between June the 21st and September the 20th when a report was written. Now, my source told me that their team has geolocated video evidence of many attacks by Russian first-person view drones on civilians. They've seen some of these attacks put to music with apparently amusing commentary and all the rest of it. I've seen comments elsewhere, not just from my source and the report that I was pointed to. I've seen other comments with people talking about these attacks on civilians, referring to a human safari in Kherson. There's a report by online analyst Tochnyi.info, which we're going to put in the episode notes, the link to the report. This is an online media organisation. They've been investigating what they say is the near-daily maiming and killing of civilians in the city of Kherson and its eastern suburbs. Now, the report, it's too long for me to go through it all here, but the report highlights the Antonivka Cemetery, for example, where many residents obviously go to bury their dead, saying that is under repeated attack. It came under drone assault numerous times in the first week of September. The funeral parlour nearby was hit once on the 2nd of September, twice on the 5th. You've got to ask why a funeral parlour is being attacked so often by drones. Petrol stations, buses and civilian vehicles also regularly targeted, the report says. Now, subsequent to the report, speaking to my source, I was told that between the 20th and the 26th of September, that was the highest week casualty-wise, a weekly record of 41 casualties in that week. The following week, there were 20 more civilian casualties, dead and injured, and 11 alone just last Friday, all from drones. Also, it seems to be connected to this remote mining of Kherson, and the suburbs also seems to be underway. In the last week, we think Russia's introduced drones dropping the PFM-1 Petal, sometimes called the butterfly mines, anti-personnel mines. They're called either petals or butterflies because of their shape, and when they're dropped, they spin and can self-scatter, if you like. Dropped in cartridges of 26, or one cartridge will chuck out 26 of these mines at a time. They can be dropped from aircraft, helicopters, jets, or mortars, drones, as in here, and they are fairly random. Now, the winged shape of the mines result in them spinning, as I say, and gliding off somewhat randomly, scattering them all over the place. since they were seen last in the last week, they have already caused civilian casualties. So there seems to be the two things: the FPV drones directly going for individuals and vehicles and houses and what have you, and then these new butterfly mines that have been introduced. Now, on Sunday, 2 days ago, Governor of Kherson Oblast, Alexander Prokudin, used his Telegram channel to try crowdsourcing a number of new electronic warfare systems to try and alleviate the suffering there. We think about 80,000 civilians still live in Kherson city and the immediate remnants of the Oblast. So the bit north of the river is still obviously in Ukrainian hands, but there's a lot of Kherson Oblast south of the river in Russian hands. But it does seem like there's really something really quite ugly happening there, more so than possibly what we've seen already in the last 2.5 years. Like I say, I've been tracking it for a little while. I didn't really know what to make of it until I was able to dig more into it. But do have a look at the report. We'll put the links in, as I say, and have a look at what's happening in Kherson. It does seem to be particularly barbaric and cynical. But then what would you expect from Russia? Now, elsewhere in Ukraine, Russian forces have reportedly advanced further into Volodar from the west and the south. Donetsk Oblast Governor Vadim Vlashkin said earlier today fighting is ongoing, but that Russian troops have entered the town. Speaking on national television, Mr. Vlashkin described the situation as extremely difficult, adding, "The enemy has already almost reached the centre of the town. The fighting is going on within the town, so it is almost impossible to bring in humanitarian aid." Now, we think over 100 civilians remain in Volodar, although it's thought all the children have been evacuated. This reporting comes from the Kyiv Independent. I'll direct you to them for their updating that story as it's ongoing. Elsewhere, continued incremental advances in the Donbass by Russia. Again, not able to go directly towards Pokrovsk. That hard edge, that hard shoulder that Ukraine established about 3 or 4 weeks ago now seems to be working. So any advances there are sort of to the south and southwest. They're sort of, the lodgement is expanding in that direction, as has been the pattern in the last couple of weeks. Now, up in Kursk in Russia, and Russian forces have made advances in the far southeast of that main pocket of land that's been held by Ukraine for some weeks now. This is about 15 kilometers southeast of Suja, the first town, the main town in that lodgement. Those are small, very small advances, just of hundreds of meters, if that. However, Ukrainian forces do seem to be pushing further northwest and expanding the second area of territory that they hold. Remember, the border there runs kind of directly east-west from roughly where Suja is. It runs west for about 30 or 40 k's and then jinks north again. So halfway along there, that was where that secondary push by Ukraine started a few weeks ago. It hasn't got very far. It's only a few kilometers in, but that bit seems to be expanding in the vicinity of a village of Vesele. Now, Ukrainian forces are thought to be spread around that town. It's difficult to really describe it as a town. It doesn't have a very obvious centre. It's a collection of a lot of houses lined on roads, forming a sort of grid with lots of open fields in between. So it's difficult to say, if they're in the centre of the town or what have you. But the Ukrainian forces seem to be spread to the east and the west of there and expanding. We're trying to push northwest to close off the rest of that salient. And if they can get east, they will eventually, after 15 or so kilometres, link up with the forces from their main bulk. But they've not been able to do that. They've not been able to link those two up in the last few weeks. Now, Russian forces in Kursk are continuing to try to establish pontoon bridges across the River Seine because they've got a huge number of troops there, some thousands, it's thought, low thousands, but in the thousands, trapped in that pocket. The three main bridges across the river were all dropped by Ukraine some weeks ago, and they're now in the process of some, kind of whack-a-mole, dropping these pontoon bridges, the military engineered bridges, temporary bridges, if you like, that are occasionally put up across the river. Now, Jimmy Rushton, you may remember, freelance journalist, he's been on the podcast a few times. He's written for us, for the Telegraph, about a visit. He's been on a visit into Kursk Oblast around Suja. He went into the centre of Suja. That's in today's paper. You'll find it online. He says that Russian FPV, so the first-person view drones, and Ukrainians, to be fair, are now much more prevalent than they were at the start. His trip had to be cut short because they could tell from their electronic warfare kit, they could tell that there were drones in the area, like very close to them, so they had to hightail it out of there. But you do go and have a look at his story online. I note though that he's Jimmy Rushton to us when he writes for the paper. Apparently he's James Rushton. Obviously it's the Telegraph. Can't be calling yourself Jimmy. Anyway, nice piece there from Jimmy. A couple of other bits and pieces, Francis. Russia's draft budget for next year for the whole country, submitted to Parliament yesterday, says that in financial year 2025, that defence spending is going to be going up to 32.5%. Now, that's an increase from this year. It's about 10 times the combined budgets that they're going to put to education and health. Just have a think about that for a moment. It equates to about 145 billion, big B billion US dollars, up from this year's 100 billion equivalent. A report in the Financial Times today says that even some top Russian officials have started warning of the rising inflationary pressures, well, from all that cash, but also the labour shortage that the war is causing. The Financial Times quotes Alina Rybakova. She's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She says the bureaucrats last year had to pretend the special operation will be over swiftly, which is clearly no longer the case. Putin is spending on the military like he doesn't care. It's not an election year. Of course he doesn't care. It's all just for his own ego. But on this as well, Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's chap in Moscow, he mentioned that the budget increase there. He was also reviewing the papers and discussing 4 new appointments to Russia's powerful Security Council, including 2 men he says are rumoured to be in the mix to take over as president after Putin. Alexei Dumin, who's Putin's former bodyguard, now in charge of the State Council. Roland Oliphant has spoken about him in the past. And the first Deputy Prime Minister, Denis Manturov. Now, Steve Rosenberg qualifies his comments by saying, in the Machiavellian world of Russian politics, you never really know what's going to happen. But interesting that there are even these names, or even just the concept of a post-Putin future is being discussed in the Russian press. And just last from me, Francis, let's go to NATO. So Mark Rutte has officially taken over from Jens Stoltenberg as NATO Secretary General in a ceremony this morning. He gave a short speech in which he outlined his 3 priorities for the alliance. Basically, ensure we have the capabilities to protect against any threat, which you'd kind of expect to be priority number 1, really. Number 2, support Ukraine in fighting back against Russian aggression. And thirdly, addressing the global challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. I mean, it's all a bit, I don't know if they're priorities or just kind of what it's for. Anyway, on Ukraine, he said, I've travelled to Ukraine several times in recent years to Odessa, Kyiv, Bucha, Borodyanka and Kharkiv, close to the Russian border, where I witnessed firsthand the brutality of Russia's war of aggression and the bravery of Ukraine's people in their fight for freedom. He said supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do, and it's also an investment in our own security, because an independent and democratic Ukraine is vital for peace and stability in Europe. And the cost of supporting Ukraine is far, far lower than the cost we would face if we allow Putin to get his way. So, pretty unequivocal comments there. He went on, he referred to his own, what he said was his own personal experience with the downing of, remember, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, a significant number of Dutch killed on that. He said he knows from the downing of flight MH17 how the conflict in Ukraine is not contained to the front lines. Interestingly, I thought, he then said, further afield, we will enhance cooperation with our Indo-Pacific partners. And he went on to say that through its support for Russia and the military industry in particular, China has become what he called a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. He said China cannot continue to fuel the largest conflict in Europe since the Second World War without this impacting its interests and reputation, which I thought was quite tough. He then said, later this month, Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea are participating in a NATO defence ministerial for the first time. I look forward to welcoming them and forging a shared approach to our shared challenges, blah, blah, blah. Now, that last bit I thought was particularly interesting about how NATO is developing relationships in the Indo-Pacific region, especially as, well, this week, Japan's just elected a new prime minister, Shigeru Ishiba, a man who's known to be an expert in defence policy and has talked about creating an Asian NATO. So NATO trying to get closer to Asia Pacific. Sounds like they might be coming the other way. All in all, I thought it was good that Ukraine got a mention in Mr. Rutte's very first words. He probably went about as far as we could expect him to go on hour 1 of his job. But no, good nonetheless. The handover, if you see photos, have a look at some photos, the handover was marked by the ceremonial passing of an historic gavel. Francis, you've probably got one of these things. Now, when I first saw it, this picture of a pretty short, stumpy bit of old wood, I thought it looked a little bit pound shop Gandalf, if I'm perfectly honest, but it's a big deal. And apologies if I've caused massive offence there for whatever the gavel means, or to fans of Gandalf. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. Well, from a pound shop Gandalf to our very own Fortnum and Mason's Saruman, delighted to go now to James Crisp, our Europe editor. James, I know that you're currently at Euston Station, which some might consider an Isengard of sorts. It's pretty bleak. We wanted to bring you in here before we go to other political stories, because yesterday we saw the Freedom Party come first in the Austrian elections, a party that is one of the most pro-Putin parties in Europe. Where do you want to start on this? What's the significance for Ukraine?
Look, I mean, it's fair to say, as you said, Francis, the Freedom Party of Austria are very much a pro-Putin party. I mean, there aren't that many parties in Europe which have a friendship pact with Putin's United Russia party. You know, you talk about the likes of Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, sort of disavowed their former admiration of the Russian president. Well, there's no such disavowal from Herbert Kickl, the leader of the victorious FPO. I mean, I'll give you an example. In March last year, FPO lawmakers strode out of the Austrian parliament when Zelensky was giving a speech via video link. Now, they claim that this address was a way of compromising Austria's constitutional neutrality, which dates back to 1955. It's why Austria is not a member of NATO. But the problem is Austria may not be a member of NATO, but it's a member of the EU. And the EU has put a series of sanctions on Russia for their illegal invasion of Ukraine. Now, the fear has to be, and look, there's a lot of coalition negotiations that have to go on, and it's possible that, Kickl won't end up being the chancellor despite the FPO winning the election for the first time. But in the coalition negotiations, maybe some of these rough edges can be knocked off, but equally they may not be. And in which case, Chancellor Kickl could join up with the likes of Hungary's Viktor Orban in the European Council to sort of either water down or even veto EU sanctions against Russia or measures to help Ukraine. So, I mean, Austria, as it stands, sends aid, financial aid to Ukraine. It's taken in 80,000 Ukrainian refugees, but it doesn't send weapons. Now, that could change. Regionally, there's more of a problem when something like this happens, and you have Slovakia, again, a pro-Putin government there, Hungary, pro-Putin, and in the Czech Republic, similar sort of region, again, one of those neighboring countries to Russia. We've just had Senate elections, which were won by a pro-Putin politician. It's worrying that basically there's a sense that maybe the soft underbelly of Europe might be getting a little bit bigger with this election victory.
Thank you very much, James. And I know you've got to dash off in a moment, but one final question from me. Do you think this is part of a trend in Europe now, or do you see this as an outlier? Of course, Putin has been relying on the fact that it would be a domino effect of countries gradually, just as part of the natural process of elections, become perhaps more opposed to the status quo on the war in Ukraine and other domestic issues in those countries. Do you see Austria as part of that pattern, or do you see it merely as a blip and that broadly Europe is still on alignment with Kyiv's perspective on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that Europe as a whole is still very supportive of Ukraine. I think that the EU as an organization has actually done quite a lot for Ukraine. It's offered it a path to eventual membership, despite it being a war. What is clear is that in the Central and Eastern European region, there is this sort of push-me-pull-you with pro-Russian and pro-Western forces. There is a risk, of course, that the FPO, they haven't tried to detoxify, they haven't tried to water down, and they've won an election. So maybe what we might see is other far-right parties thinking, well, we don't need to tone this down. We can be out there and proud and still win. I mean, look, Austria on its own doesn't move the dial when it comes to EU politics. Austria plus Hungary plus Slovakia plus maybe Czech, okay, it's a bit more problematic. But I think the EU is going to stay sort of steadfast, but there is a sort of a sign of some weakening resolve, specifically in areas which border Russia, specifically in areas which have sort of a history of closer ties with Moscow, countries which maybe have fallen victim to Russian disinformation. and countries which are struggling with a cost of living crisis and rising inflation brought around by the war in Ukraine. I mean, we've even seen it in Germany, where the AfD is doing very well, and the AfD, like the FPO, are totally unapologetic about their desire to appease Putin and basically sell out Kyiv. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. It's not a terminal situation, but it is a worrying development.
Thanks, James. And just before you go, what will you be doing in Brussels?
I'll be in Brussels chasing Keir Starmer around as he is going there to meet EU leaders and hold talks on the next generation of Brexit negotiations with Ursula von der Leyen. So if you guys thought that Brexit was done and over, I've got news for you, I'm afraid. It's winding back up again.
Scintillating stuff. Well, thank you very much, James, and we'd be delighted to have you back on as soon as you're back from Brussels, and no doubt have some more intel to give us there from the Mood on Ukraine subjects. Let's turn to the other political updates now. Yesterday we talked in detail about the vital meetings that took place in and around the UN in New York, followed closely around the world, including in the trenches of Ukraine. For it is those soldiers, after all, who will feel the impact of the decisions made there the most. As friend of the podcast Christopher Miller and his fellow journalists at the Financial Times write today, quote, in a command post near the embattled eastern Ukrainian city of Makrovsk, soldiers of the separate presidential brigade bemoan the dithering in Washington about whether Kyiv can use Western missiles to strike targets inside Russia. If only they were able to fight with both hands instead of with one hand tied behind our back. Then Ukraine's plucky troops might stand a chance against the Russian army, laments one attack drone operator. If the US turns off the spigot, we're finished, says another officer, a member of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade in nearby Kurahove. Now, their sources at the Financial Times suggest that US officials were unimpressed by Zelensky's victory plan. It quotes an advisor who helped prepare the document that Zelensky had no choice, he says, but to reinstate his insistence on NATO membership, because anything else would have been perceived as a retreat on the question of Western security guarantees. Again, quoting the piece, despite Washington's misgivings, the ability to strike Russian territory is also central to Zelensky's victory plan, said the advisor. While US officials have argued that Russia has already moved strike aircraft beyond the range of Western missiles, Ukrainian officials insist that there are plenty of other targets, such as command centres, weapons caches, fuel depots and logistics nodes. Destroying them could disrupt Moscow's ability to wage war, show Putin that his objectives of seizing at least 4 whole provinces of Ukraine are untenable, and disprove his conviction that the West will lose interest. Another interesting aspect of the piece is that it says multiple European diplomats who attended the General Assembly noted there was a tangible shift in the tone of discussions around a potential settlement. They note more openness from Ukrainian officials to discuss the potential for agreeing a ceasefire even while Russian troops remain on their territory, and more frank discussions among Western officials about the urgency for some kind of deal. Ukraine's new foreign minister used private meetings with his Western counterparts to discuss potential compromise solutions, the diplomat said, and struck a more pragmatic tone on the possibility of land for security negotiations. Now again, and this is me here, it is not inconceivable this is Kyiv preparing for the worst case scenarios for Trump victory in November and is laying the groundwork for an emergency endgame accordingly. But equally, without the weapons permissions on long-range strike capabilities, they clearly do feel hamstrung, from whether that be the politicians at Kyiv to the soldiers who are actually on the front line doing the fighting. Now, speaking of front lines, it is important just to note here that the Middle East situation is, from Ukraine's perspective, not an insignificant distraction. Several hours ago, the Israel Defense Forces began what they called a targeted and demarcated ground operation in southern Lebanon against terrorist targets of Hezbollah in a number of villages near the border, which pose an immediate and real threat to Israeli settlements on the northern border. That's quoting them. Diplomats in the region and globally, not least in the United States, are on edge of the risk of some kind of larger scale war erupting in the region. And for those of you who are following that closely, Roland Oliphant and other Telegraph colleagues are covering it in detail for our sister podcast, Battle Lines. We'll add a link in the description to that. Listeners will remember that President Biden tried to tie both Israel and Ukraine together when seeking to get his military aid package past Congress. But that talk has ended now, and they are seen as distinct issues, for right or wrong. Another subject the White House has stopped talking about, if it ever really did so in a meaningful way, is the manner that weapons and munitions production for Ukraine is leading to what the Washington Post calls an economic boon in parts of the United States. As it writes, and I quote, "Since Russia began its full-scale invasion, the federal government has allocated nearly $175 billion in emergency assistance for the conflict. But much of that money remains in the US. It powers plants like the Army's factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which makes 155mm artillery rounds, and others in Alabama, which make armoured personnel carriers, and Texas, where mobile artillery rocket systems are built. General Dynamics, the contractor that runs the 116-year-old Scranton Army ammunition plant, has added more than 200 jobs in the region since 2022. Artillery production more than doubled." Close quote. Now, had the White House talked up the ways in which communities like those are benefiting from the US's assistance of Ukraine, then perhaps that would have stopped the Republicans being able to attack the conflict for being bad for the American taxpayer. As it is, though, Republicans have, of course, sought to suggest that American dollars are simply going to Kyiv in a direct transfer, which has never been the case. But I think many would argue it's too late to change the narrative now prior to the election. But just to end this section with a different kind of story, a very interesting one, I think, former President Jimmy Carter, the 39th, who was in office, of course, from 1977 to 1981, ironically brought down by the Iran hostage crisis. And it's, as I say, ironic that Iran is very much the attention of the issue this week. But he turns 100 today, becoming the first former president to mark that milestone. A installation celebrating it has been installed on the north lawn of the White House, timed to coincide with Carter reaching that milestone. In a video message ahead of Carter's birthday, President Biden praised the ex-commander-in-chief, saying, and don't worry, I'm not going to butcher his accent like Roland did the other day, "Mr. President, I admire you so darn much. Your hopeful vision of our country, your commitment to a better world, and your unwavering belief in the power of human goodness continues to be a guiding light for all of us." Now, a fun fact, I think I'm right in saying, and no doubt listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, that the grandson of the 10th president, John Tyler, is still alive. Hard as that is to believe, Tyler was born in the last years of the 18th century, around 1790 or so, but had children late, as did his son, hence why his grandson is still alive and in his 90s. So I think I'm right in getting that correct. So if true, history isn't as long ago as we think. But that's enough for this section. We're going to go a bit cultural now. Dom, you rather cryptically said before we came on air that you had some thoughts about the new art installation in Sofia, Bulgaria. Now, we all know your love of art from the less than flattering caricatures you sometimes draw and post on X. But what's caught your eye about this story?
Yeah, well, no, I'm all over contemporary art. You know, been to Margate, go for the chips, stay for the art, that kind of thing. But I did see today Valina Chakarova, geopolitical strategist, friend to the pod. She tweeted a picture of the new art installation, as you say, in Sofia in Bulgaria by artist Krasimir Terziev. Now, I thought this was quite nice. Illuminated letters inscribed in a big circle. They have the sort of 10-metre diameter circle, each letter nearly half a metre high and deep. So you can walk in and walk around it and be inside the installation, all that kind of stuff. And it's lit up at night, all the rest of it. And the words say, between the past that is about to happen and the future that has already been. And I thought I was quite telling. I've retweeted Valina's post, so have a look at that. Between the past that is about to happen and the future that has already been. Valina says that captures Europe in one sentence. The artist says it addresses visions of the future in which we're not just the audience of monumental spectacles, as he says. But when I first saw it, it made me think about war in general, but especially this one about Ukraine that we focus on, obviously, but also about our place in the world. Maybe think about David and about how he has, like many people in Ukraine today, been denied any number of possible futures. Anyway, did what great art does, like my doodles, Francis. It makes you think, makes you sort of pause for a moment and just reflect and think about things, and doesn't actually matter what it's what it's supposed to be, what the artist wants it to be. Is what you think and what you feel about it. I thought it was quite striking. I invite people to go and have a look, either at the one that I retweeted or Felina's post, or go and have a look at the website with it on, with the artist space on. But I thought it was rather nice, a nice little thing. I don't know of how long it's going to be there, if it's a permanent installation there in Sofia, but it would be quite nice to visit it. But if anyone's been there, do please let us know what you think. Well, let us know what you think anyway. But if anyone's been there, I'd love to hear your first-hand account of what it's like, especially at night. There's some very striking photos of it at dusk with beautiful sort of sunset behind and all the rest of it. But no, very, very nice. Do go and have a look at it, folks.
Thanks, Dom. Well, let's stay with culture for a little bit longer. Today, as you said in your section earlier, is the day that Ukraine honours its war dead. At 9 a.m. its time, the entirety of Ukraine stopped to honour those who have fallen in defence of the country. The footage you referenced is quite moving, with traffic, pedestrians, school, cafes, all silent. Zelensky addressed those soldiers, and I'll quote from him now. He said, "For 951 days, you have been writing history on the battlefield. You sacrifice yourselves so that Ukraine does not have to be sacrificed. Both those who were born a warrior and those who became one, those who changed their lives so that our freedom would remain unchanged. Those who had different professions but refused to live under another flag. Those who said to themselves, 'I have no other choice, for this is my homeland, this is my Ukraine, and I will defend it.' Defending Ukraine. Two words that have united millions of people, our country and our nation. On behalf of all of them, I say to you, thank you. To each and every one of you, we are proud of you all." That's President Zelensky there. As we were discussing before we came on air, Dom, it has echoes, that commemoration, of how we remember our war dead here in Britain and in many other countries around the Commonwealth. But there is a significant difference regarding the dead themselves, with a fierce debate taking place in Ukraine at the moment, which the Kyiv Independent summarises brilliantly in a piece this week, about what to do with the bodies. In a conversation that has echoes of what Lincoln contended with during the American Civil War, many Ukrainians are asking why Ukraine doesn't have a national military cemetery. And as the Kyiv Indie writes, again I'm quoting here, "Many veterans and their families fear this neglect reflects a lack of respect for those who have sacrificed their lives. It's as if there were no Arlington National Cemetery, a sacred space for remembrance and a powerful symbol of national gratitude. Instead of transparency constructing a national memorial cemetery, the authorities have dragged out the selection of a site, proposing locations far from Kyiv. The design and tendering process is marred by scandals, which critics say further diminishes the significance of soldier sacrifices. Despite the urgency, there has been little progress. Local regions have been left to bury their soldiers within existing cemeteries, where graves often blend in with civilian ones." Now, soldiers' graves blending with civilian ones is quite a common feature of war graves here in Britain, although most of our war dead are, of course, buried where they fell, especially from the First and Second World Wars, in Europe. But then we also have somewhere to gather here, which is symbolic of all of our dead, the cenotaph here in London. So, Dom, just to bring you in here, you served, of course, as a soldier for over 25 years. When you hear this story and you think about how we remember our war dead here, and you ponder the significance of Ukraine possibly getting its own national cemetery, what are your reactions?
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I mean, you'll know much better than me, but please don't bang on for too long about Arlington and when and how that came into being. From my memory, it was as an effort to mark the end of something, the Civil War, and an effort to bring the country together. Now, I think both of those criteria are absent now in Ukraine, because I think many people in Ukraine would refute that this is a civil war. A lot of Russians would say that. They would say it's not a civil war. This is a war of aggression by another country. So it's not it doesn't need to try and address that issue, and it's also not the start of a new country. This might be a significant moment in the country's history, but I don't think, from friends of ours in Ukraine and Ukrainian friends over here, I don't think they see it as, this is the start. This is the new country. I think 1991 was taken to be that sort of, if you're going to pick a date. So I think there are different issues here about should you have a central place or not. I mean, we culturally we've never really gone for that in this country. There's the whole apologies, if you're in the audience, when we had the empire thingy, you just couldn't bring bodies back. So people were buried where they were, and that sort of gave rise to, well, epitomised in the Rupert Brooke poem, paraphrasing from memory. There's some corner of a foreign field that will forever be England, I think. Yeah, the idea that you don't have to come back here. You are from where you are, and you lie where you fall. That was the deal, because we just couldn't bring people back from all around the world, and that sort of sunk into our cultural psyche. We have village war memorials, for example, but no central place, bar the cenotaph, the great stone memorial on Whitehall here in central London. That all it has inscribed on it is "the glorious dead." I mean, quite a blunt phrase, "the glorious dead." But in many ways, that's it. That's what it's about. You don't need to dress it up any other way. It says what it is. That's quite brilliant, I think, in its stark beauty, really. So it's obviously not for me to necessarily have a view on whether Ukraine should have a national cemetery. There are clearly pros and cons to both. I mean, Ukraine, as we've discovered, quite a big place. So it's difficult for people to get around if you're not very nearby where it's going to be, where it's proposed to be. And equally, does it need that totemic image? This is a national fight for survival, so should the memories be spread across the entire nation as the casualties are? I wonder. It's a really interesting point. It's an interesting article. I very much welcome people's views on it, but I think we view it very differently in this country, and I think our American cousins would also take a very different view. And I mean, Arlington is a wonderful place. I've been there a number of times. It's a very, very solemn, very respectful, beautiful piece of land, and it's looked after impeccably. So I have huge respect for that, if that's what you wish to do with your country. But it's just not necessarily the way we've done it here. They all have equal value, depending on the culture they come from and the reasons you decide upon to produce these things. But no, I welcome everyone's thoughts.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. I'm testing my English A-level here, but I think the quote is, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." If that's wrong, then then correct me, but I think that's right. I think you're right, Dom, to talk about Arlington and its significance. Now, interestingly, again, American listeners, if I'm wrong here, do feel free to correct me. We're very keen that you do. That Arlington National Cemetery is on the old grounds of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general's private home. And indeed, the old home is actually the Arlington site, the main sort of house at the graveyard. And so when it was created, it was really to commemorate the Union dead who had fought for one side in the Civil War. But, and the crucial thing is that it became much more national, North and South, around 40 years later at the turn of the century, around 1900, I think, when it was decided by Congress that Confederate soldiers could be moved to Arlington, and therefore it became a national memorial for soldiers of all stripes in the Civil War. So again, that's also quite interesting, is the way in which the sites of memory and commemoration can evolve over time in how they are perceived and their significance. Again, as we've spoken about on the podcast previously, you were talking there, Dom, about the First World War battlefields being abroad, and that being a different way that we remember and commemorate. Nowadays, we look at those and we commemorate, I think, more than just the First World War when we visit those sites, but we commemorate all war to a degree and the folly of war. Certainly that's the way that we're taught to see them, I think, when we go around the battlefield sites of France and Belgium, is to reflect more broadly. But what's interesting is that for many decades after the First World War, they were seen as very, very specifically about the First World War. And indeed, because of that, because the First World War had still so many veterans who were alive from that period, they weren't seen as necessarily particularly special places. And what I mean by that is there were generations that did not go to battlefield cemeteries, that did not go to the Menin Gate in Ypres, where the trumpets would blow and there would be no audience. But now, once again, a century on, there is always crowded every single night when the trumpets blow in Ypres, as they have done since 1919, I believe, to commemorate the sacrifice of the Commonwealth soldiers who died fighting for Belgium. So it's interesting how our memory evolves. And so whatever conversation that we're having now about how Ukraine commemorates its war dead, whether it be in a national cemetery, whether it be in a more scattered way, it will be something that no doubt will change over time. And indeed, the way that Ukrainians remember will change over time. And so something, again, very interested in hearing listeners' perspectives on this, whether that be in Ukraine or whether it be around the world, in how you reflect differently on your war dead over time. I'm always really interested in hearing that perspective on how those things change, because they certainly do change. And indeed, the way we revere the war dead particularly is very unique in human history. One could argue that, for instance, really for the majority of human history, if you died on the battlefield, that was it. I mean, the battlefield of Waterloo, they ground up the bodies and turned them into fertiliser. And before that, they withdrew the teeth from the bodies left on the battlefield and turned them into dentures. Hence why in London you would buy your Waterloo dentures, literally from the dead of Waterloo. So this is a constantly evolving thing. But as I say, it's a really interesting subject, which is why we thought it would be worth a note today. But we recommend that piece in the Kyiv Independent for those who are interested. Coming up, Dom's final thought, including more information about David's funeral at 11:15 London time this Thursday. Dom, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that, or shall we go to our final thoughts? I leave it with you.
No, thanks. The thought of your dentures has done me for the day, to be honest, Francis. But so I will go to final thoughts, if I may. But I guess continuing theme a little bit. I mean, who would have thought, with Arlington and, of course, not forgetting, thank you, Mark, yes, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier here in Westminster Abbey, to mark the end of the First World War, to mark those known unto God, is the phraseology. No one knows who they are. There's just not enough to bring them back. So 4 bodies were selected at random, and then one was picked, and that body came back and is buried now in Westminster Abbey to mark all those who don't have a grave. But yeah, so when that was being thought of, and Arlington and the cenotaph, I mean, who would have thought of live streaming any of that? But we are going to be live streaming, as we said, David's funeral on Thursday. That should start at 11:15 on Thursday with some music and singing from the choir, and then the service will start at 11:30 London time. I've had a number of people say they will endeavour to join us, so thank you very much for that. We've had people all over from the UK, obviously, and from France, from the US, which is going to be pretty early. It kicks off at 11:30. What's that? 7:30 East Coast, is it? Something like that. Pretty early there. On Australia, where it's going to be very late, nearly midnight, I think, in Australia. We're delighted that you want to share the time with us and say cheerio to our pal. And please join us on Thursday if you have time.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.